In the aftermath of World War II, the world stood at a crossroads. Two superpowers emerged from the ashes of global conflict, the United States and the Soviet Union. They had defeated a common enemy, but their visions for the future could not have been more different. In the Far East, on a small peninsula called Korea, a divided nation would become the flashpoint for humanity's greatest fear, the beginning of World War III. What began as a regional conflict in June 1950 would draw America into one of the most consequential and brutal wars of the Cold War era. For 3 long years, American soldiers would fight in frozen mountains and devastated cities. Tens of thousands would give their lives. Millions of Korean civilians would suffer unimaginable loss. Yet today, the Korean War remains largely forgotten in American memory, overshadowed by World War II before it and Vietnam after it. But the echoes of this war still shape our world. The decisions made in 1950 created a divided peninsula that remains divided to this day, and they set the template for American Cold War interventions that would define the next 50 years. This is the story of America's Korean War. This is the story of duty, sacrifice, and the terrible human cost of containing communism. A divided nation. Historical background and Korea's liberation. To understand why America went to war in Korea, we must first understand how Korea came to be divided. For 35 years, from 1910 to 1945, the Korean peninsula languished under Japanese colonial rule. Japan had conquered the peninsula at the turn of the century, incorporating it into its expanding empire. Korean nationalism simmered beneath the surface, suppressed but never extinguished. Generations of Koreans dreamed of independence, of a unified nation free from foreign domination. Then came August 1945, Japan. Facing annihilation after the atomic bombings and Soviet invasion of Manchuria, surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. The 35-year nightmare of Japanese occupation finally ended, but Korea's suffering was not yet over. It would only transform into a different kind of tragedy. In those chaotic final days of World War II, American military planners faced an urgent problem. Soviet forces were sweeping across Manchuria toward the Korean peninsula. How could the United States prevent the entire peninsula from falling under Soviet control? American military officials, 2 junior officers named Dean Rusk and Charles Bonestell, were given a seemingly impossible task: divide Korea. Working with just a National Geographic map, with no Korean experts consulted, they drew a line across the 38th parallel. It was an arbitrary choice, made in haste, with little consideration for Korean geography, culture, or history. The line divided the country roughly in half, though it placed the capital, Seoul, under the American zone. To everyone's surprise, the Soviet Union accepted this division without objection. On August 15, 1945, Soviet forces crossed into northern Korea. American troops would not arrive in the south until September. What was intended as a temporary military boundary to accept Japanese surrender would harden into a permanent division. Korea, a nation unified for centuries, became 2 nations. The north fell under Soviet influence, the south under American protection. 16 million Koreans lived in the American zone. 9 million lived in the Soviet zone. Families were separated. A nation was cleaved in 2. In the north, the Soviets installed Kim Il-sung as leader, a communist revolutionary who promised to transform Korea into a workers' paradise. In the south, Americans supported Syngman Rhee, a Korean politician with a checkered past who promised democracy and capitalism. Both leaders claimed to represent all of Korea. Both looked across the 38th parallel as a temporary line that would soon vanish when their ideology conquered the entire peninsula. But by 1948, 2 separate nations were formally established: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, and the Republic of Korea in the south. The division was complete. The tragedy had truly begun. Why was Korea divided, and why did it matter to the United States? The division of Korea in 1945 was one of the great accidents of history. 2 young American officers, with minimal expertise, drew a line on a map that would shape the entire Cold War in Asia. Korea mattered to the United States because of where it sat at, the intersection of Soviet, Chinese, and American interests. If all of Korea fell to communism, the entire balance of power in the Far East would shift dramatically. The US believed it had to defend South Korea, not just for the Koreans themselves, but to prove that America would stand by its commitments anywhere in the world. By 1950, the stakes had risen considerably. Communist forces under Mao Zedong had just won the Chinese Civil War, creating a massive communist nation on Korea's border. The Soviets possessed atomic weapons. American military planners feared that communism was on the march across Asia, and that if Korea fell, domino after domino would topple. The United States, they believed, had to draw a line in the sand. Neither Washington nor Moscow expected war in Korea, but both were willing to test the other's resolve. The invasion, North Korea attacks. On Sunday, June 25, 1950, at 4 a.m. Korean time, the world changed. Across the 38th parallel, columns of North Korean tanks and infantry surged southward. For months, Kim Il-sung had been requesting permission from Stalin to invade the south. The Soviet leader, believing the United States would not intervene, finally gave his blessing. Now, North Korea's Korean People's Army, equipped and trained by Soviet military advisors, unleashed a massive assault on the unprepared South. The invasion caught South Korea completely off guard. The Republic of Korea's army, the ROKA, was hastily trained and poorly equipped. They had few tanks, limited artillery, and minimal combat experience. Against the onslaught of the North Korean People's Army, battle-hardened veterans of campaigns in Manchuria, they crumbled. The North Koreans attacked along multiple corridors, driving straight toward Seoul. South Korean defensive positions collapsed like dominoes. In desperate fighting around the cities of Osan and Taijin, American military advisors who had been stationed in Korea were caught in the chaos. Some were captured, others managed to escape southward. The collapse of Seoul was a humiliation and a catastrophe. The South Korean government evacuated the capital on June 27. As they fled, engineers blew up the Hangang Bridge, the Great Bridge across the Han River in an attempt to slow the North Korean advance. The explosion occurred while thousands of refugees were crossing. Hundreds died in that blast alone. The bridge, destroyed, trapped thousands of South Korean soldiers north of the river, cut off from their army. Seoul fell on June 28, 1950. The capital was in enemy hands. The North Korean forces drove deeper into the peninsula, pursuing the retreating South Koreans and their American advisors. Within weeks, the ROKA and the handful of American forces present were pushed into the extreme southeast corner of the peninsula, around the port city of Busan. The situation was desperate. Some American officials in Washington wondered if Korea was already lost. But President Harry S. Truman was about to make a decision that would change everything. America enters the war. Truman's decision, the United Nations, and the first battles. President Harry Truman received word of the invasion on June 24, 1950 American time. He was at his home in Missouri. His Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, called immediately with news of the attack. Truman's response was swift and decisive. "We can't let the UN down," Truman told Acheson. "We can't let them have Korea." But Truman faced a critical decision. Would he ask Congress to declare war, or would he find another way? Truman chose an unprecedented path. He would not request a formal declaration of war from Congress. Instead, he would work through the newly formed United Nations. The Korean conflict would be framed not as an American war, but as a UN police action, a collective effort by the free nations of the world to repel communist aggression. Remarkably, this worked. On June 25 and June 27, 1950, the United Nations Security Council passed resolutions calling for a ceasefire and authorizing member nations to provide military assistance to South Korea. Normally, the Soviet Union would have vetoed any such resolution. But Stalin had ordered Soviet diplomats to boycott the Security Council over a different dispute: the refusal to recognize Communist China. In that fortunate absence, the resolution passed. Truman compared the North Korean invasion to Hitler's aggressions in the 1930s. The lesson of Munich, that appeasement invites further aggression, had been burned into his memory. He was determined that the West would not retreat. Truman ordered General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of Allied powers in Japan, to commit American forces to Korea. This was an extraordinary choice. MacArthur was a living legend, the general who had led the island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, who had overseen the occupation of Japan. He was 70 years old, a towering figure of American military history. In many ways, he was a man out of the modern age, flamboyant, theatrical, utterly convinced of his own genius. But Truman believed that MacArthur was the only general capable of turning around the deteriorating situation in Korea. On June 30, 1950, just 6 days after the invasion, Truman authorized MacArthur to commit American ground troops to Korea. The decision was made in lightning speed by Washington standards. What had seemed impossible days before, American intervention in Asia, was now official policy. American troops began arriving in Korea in early July 1950. The first unit to see significant combat was a small forward element called Task Force Smith, just 540 soldiers from the 24th Infantry Division, hastily flown in from Japan. On July 5, they attacked North Korean forces at the town of Osan, south of Seoul. The battle was a disaster. American soldiers, trained and equipped for World War II, found themselves facing Soviet T-34 tanks, the same tanks that had terrorized Europe years before. American anti-tank weapons were inadequate. Within hours, Task Force Smith was overrun. Many soldiers were killed or captured. The task force retreated in disarray. American commanders realized they were facing a more powerful enemy than expected. The U.S. Army, downsized and demoralized since the end of World War II, was not ready for conventional warfare. Many soldiers were poorly trained, fresh from occupation duty in Japan. They were facing an enemy that was disciplined, well-equipped, and motivated by ideology. But more American troops kept arriving. By late July, enough American and South Korean forces had concentrated around the port city of Pusan to establish a defensive line. The Pusan perimeter. This was the last foothold in South Korea. If it fell, the peninsula would be completely lost to communism. American soldiers, supported by air power and naval bombardment, dug in around Pusan. They were exhausted, frightened, and often inadequately trained. But they held the line. Throughout July and August 1950, the battle raged around the perimeter. North Korean forces, confident that they could overrun the Americans, threw themselves against the defensive positions. But the Americans held. American air power, especially, was devastating. Napalm and conventional bombs destroyed North Korean supply lines and killed thousands of soldiers. By early September, the perimeter was still intact. The North Koreans, despite their initial success, could not break through. The tide, unseen by most observers at the time, was about to turn. Incheon and the push north. MacArthur's gamble and the Chinese intervention. General Douglas MacArthur was a man of audacity and imagination. While most military leaders counseled patience holding the Pusan perimeter and gradually pushing the North Koreans back, MacArthur conceived a bolder plan. He would execute an amphibious landing deep behind enemy lines at the port city of Incheon, near Seoul. Military commanders thought he was insane. Incheon was one of the world's most difficult amphibious objectives. The harbor had extreme tidal ranges, sometimes 30 feet between high and low tide. The beaches were terrible. Enemy forces controlled the area. It would be the most dangerous amphibious operation since D-Day. But MacArthur was convinced it would work. He believed that if he could land forces at Incheon and cut off the North Korean supply lines, the entire invasion would collapse. The North Koreans would be trapped between the Pusan perimeter to the south and the Incheon forces to the north. It was audacious, risky, and perhaps impossible. Yet Truman approved it. On September 15, 1950, after weeks of preparation and bombardment, American forces launched Operation Chromite. The Incheon landing, Marines and Army troops, covered by naval gunfire and air support, stormed ashore at Incheon. Fighting was fierce, but the Americans overcame the initial North Korean defenses. Within days, a beachhead was established. American forces pushed inland towards Seoul. Seoul fell to the Americans on September 25. The North Korean forces, now with their supply lines severed and surrounded on multiple sides, began a desperate retreat northward. In just 3 months, the military situation had completely reversed. The North Koreans, who had seemed on the verge of victory in August, were now in full retreat. By late September, thousands of North Korean soldiers were fleeing northward. Many did not make it, captured, killed, or surrendered. The invading army that had seemed so formidable was disintegrating. With the North Koreans in retreat, military leaders began asking a fateful question: should the war continue only until the 38th parallel was restored? Or should American and United Nations forces pursue the enemy into North Korea and attempt to reunify the peninsula under a non-communist government? It was a critical decision. Stopping at the 38th parallel would preserve the original goal, defending South Korea. But pushing north offered the possibility of something greater: ending communism in Korea entirely, reunifying the nation, and achieving a stunning Cold War victory. MacArthur argued passionately for pushing north. So did many politicians and military leaders in Washington. By late September, Truman gave permission for the crossing. North Korean territory would now become a battleground. American and South Korean forces swept northward in October 1950. They captured Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, on October 19th. American soldiers, riding on the crest of victory, pushed deeper into North Korea. Military intelligence confidently predicted that the war would be over by Christmas. American soldiers would be home, the peninsula would be unified, and communism would have suffered a major defeat. But they were not the only power watching the campaign unfold. In Beijing, Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong watched with growing alarm. American forces were now approaching China's border, the Yalu River. Mao saw this as a direct threat to Chinese security. He began to issue warnings through diplomatic channels. If American forces crossed the Yalu and threatened China itself, China would enter the war. Washington dismissed these warnings. American military intelligence, headed by General Charles Willoughby, believed that China would not dare intervene. The United States possessed atomic weapons. China did not. Surely Mao would not risk a war with America. MacArthur was even more dismissive. He believed the war was already won. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In late October 1950, as American forces approached the Yalu River, Chinese soldiers began crossing into North Korea. Officially, they were called Chinese People's Volunteers, an attempt to suggest they were not part of the official Chinese army. But they were battle-hardened troops from the Chinese People's Liberation Army, veterans of the recent Chinese Civil War. Estimates suggest that between 250,000 and 300,000 Chinese soldiers secretly entered North Korea in October and early November 1950, moving at night and hiding during the day to avoid detection by American air superiority. On October 25, Chinese forces ambushed South Korean troops near the town of Unsan. Over 12 days of fierce fighting, the Chinese drove South Korean divisions back, inflicting tens of thousands of casualties. By early November, it became clear. The Chinese had entered the war in massive force. American commanders were stunned. The confident predictions of victory evaporated overnight. Instead of a war winding down, America faced a much larger conflict now against both North Korea and China. The most famous and brutal encounter came in late November 1950 at the Chosin Reservoir in northeastern North Korea. American and British forces, moving deeper into North Korean territory, found themselves surrounded by Chinese forces in one of the worst winters in recent memory. Temperatures plummeted to 20 degrees below zero. The Americans were cut off. What followed was one of the most harrowing episodes in American military history. The 1st Marine Division, trapped at Chosin Reservoir, had to fight their way out 13 days of savage combat in Arctic conditions. Thousands of American soldiers were killed or wounded. Thousands more suffered from severe frostbite and exposure. The Marines eventually broke out, but it was a devastating blow to American confidence. The narrative of inevitable victory was shattered. America was not going to win the Korean War quickly. Instead, it faced the prospect of a long, grinding conflict. A stalemate on a frozen peninsula, far from home, against an enemy that seemed willing to absorb any number of casualties to achieve victory. The cost of war, the human toll, military and civilian suffering. By the time the chosen reservoir battle ended, the character of the Korean War had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a war of rapid maneuvers and grand strategy. It had become a brutal, grinding contest. A war of attrition where both sides poured young men into a meat grinder and accepted appalling casualties. The cost in human life was staggering. By the time the war ended in July 1953, more than 54,000 American service members had been killed. Of these, over 33,000 were killed in direct combat. Another 103,000 were wounded. For perspective, this means that American forces suffered about 18,000 casualties per year in Korea, rate 3 times higher than in Vietnam, which Americans remember as a far bloodier conflict. But American casualties were nothing compared to the Korean people. Somewhere between 2 and 3 million Koreans died in the war. The vast majority were civilians, women, children, the elderly, those with no connection to the fighting. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Pyongyang, the North Korean capital, was so completely destroyed that American generals reported that there was almost nothing left standing. The city became a frozen wasteland of ruins and snow. North Korea suffered the most. Approximately 12 to 15% of the North Korean population, about 1 million people, were killed during the war. It was, in percentage terms, one of the deadliest conflicts of the Cold War era. Major cities were destroyed. Factories, schools, hospitals, and government offices were forced underground or abandoned. Both sides committed atrocities. North Korean forces, in their retreat after the Incheon landing, massacred hundreds of thousands of captured South Korean civilians and suspected political opponents. South Korean and American forces also committed killings of civilians, particularly through air bombardment campaigns that killed refugees and non-combatants. The American air war was especially devastating. The United States flew thousands of bombing sorties over North Korea, using conventional bombs and napalm. The bombing destroyed bridges, roads, factories, and military targets, but it also killed countless civilians. In many cases, North Korean leaders were forced to move their government underground and rely on tunnels and caves for shelter. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of the war was the suffering of ordinary Korean families. Millions were separated from loved ones, sometimes forever, by the fighting and the division that followed. Families in the North had no contact with relatives in the South for 70 years. The war shattered communities, divided families, and left psychological scars that would persist for generations. South Korea's economy was devastated. The country's economic losses exceeded $6 billion, an enormous figure for a developing nation. The inflation rate reached 120%. Cities were in ruins. The countryside was scarred by combat. Refugee camps overflowed with the displaced and the homeless. In April 1951, with the war deadlocked and the casualties mounting, President Truman made another dramatic decision. He fired General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur, frustrated by Truman's insistence on limiting the war and avoiding direct conflict with China, had been openly critical of the president's policies. He had suggested expanding the war to China itself, using atomic weapons, and accepting unlimited casualties in pursuit of total victory. Truman disagreed. He believed that the Korean War had to remain limited, that escalating to direct conflict with China or the Soviet Union could trigger World War III, and that no territorial gain in Korea was worth risking nuclear war. So Truman relieved MacArthur of his command and replaced him with General Matthew B. Ridgway, a different kind of general. Ridgway was less flamboyant, more pragmatic. His mission was not to win in Korea, but to hold the line and stabilize the situation. For the next 2 years, the war evolved into a deadly stalemate. American and UN forces held the line roughly along the 38th parallel, approximately where the division between North and South Korea had originally been. The North Koreans and Chinese, despite repeated offensives and massive casualties, could not break the American lines. Conversely, American forces, despite their superior firepower, could not defeat the Communists. The fighting became characterized by small unit actions, hill-to-hill combat, and grinding attrition. Young American soldiers, drafted or enlisted, found themselves fighting in mountains they had never heard of, in a war they often did not understand, against an enemy that seemed willing to absorb any number of casualties. The psychological toll was enormous. Soldiers reported a sense of futility, that they were fighting not to win, but simply to hold ground against an endless enemy. Some battles were fought for strategic objectives of dubious value. Soldiers died to capture hills that would later be abandoned, only to be captured again. Yet, through it all, American forces held the line. UN forces, which included troops from 21 nations, stood firm against the Chinese and North Korean forces. Armistice and aftermath. The agreement that was not a peace treaty. As 1952 turned into 1953, both sides grew weary. The Chinese and North Koreans realized they could not defeat the Americans militarily. The Americans realized they could not conquer North Korea without unacceptable casualties and the risk of wider war. Negotiations began at a place called Panmunjom, along the 38th parallel. These talks dragged on for months, with both sides haggling over every detail. One major sticking point was the issue of prisoners of war. Many North Korean and Chinese prisoners held by UN forces refused repatriation. They did not want to return home to communist rule. The communists demanded that all prisoners be returned. The West insisted on voluntary repatriation. Finally, on July 27, 1953, an armistice agreement was signed. Exhausted commanders on both sides agreed to stop fighting and establish a ceasefire. The Korean War was not over. Technically, it ended not with a peace treaty, but with an armistice. The two sides agreed to cease hostilities and establish a demilitarized zone (DMZ) along the 38th parallel. In this buffer zone, no military forces would be allowed. But the armistice was not a peace. It was simply a ceasefire, a pause in hostilities that has lasted 70 years. No formal peace treaty was ever signed. Technically, North and South Korea remain at war locked in an armistice that neither side has formally ended. The division that had seemed temporary in 1945 became permanent. Korea remained divided, not by ideology alone, but by barbed wire, mines, and armed soldiers. The DMZ, the demilitarized zone, became one of the most militarized borders in the world. Today, nearly 70 years later, the border between North and South Korea remains one of the most tense, heavily fortified boundaries on Earth. American forces remained in South Korea. They remain there today. The United States had committed itself to defending South Korea against communism. That commitment, made in 1950, continues to this day. For the Koreans, the war was a tragedy without resolution. It had killed millions, destroyed their country, and permanently separated their nation. The promised unification never came. Instead, the peninsula would remain divided for the foreseeable future. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Korea was a devastated land. The economic losses were catastrophic. American aid, eventually totaling $1.5 billion in direct assistance, helped South Korea begin reconstruction. Schools, roads, and communications infrastructure were rebuilt. But the psychological scars ran deep. Families remained separated. Millions of Koreans had relatives they would never see again, cut off by the border and the politics of Cold War division. Korean War veterans, on both sides, lived with memories of combat and trauma that would never entirely heal. The American public, meanwhile, largely forgot about Korea. The war received far less attention in media and popular culture than World War II, before it, or Vietnam after it. Korean War veterans would later describe their conflict as the Forgotten War, a war that Americans fought and died in, but one that seemed to vanish from national consciousness once the shooting stopped. From ruins to prosperity. South Korea's extraordinary transformation. Yet, from the ashes of war, one remarkable story emerged. The transformation of South Korea, from a devastated, impoverished nation into one of the world's most dynamic modern economies. In the 1950s, South Korea was desperately poor. The war had destroyed nearly everything. Per capita income was less than $100 per year. Millions were homeless or living in refugee camps. The nation had almost no industrial base and few natural resources. Many experts believed South Korea could not survive without perpetual American aid. But beginning in the 1960s, under strong-willed leaders like Park Chung-hee, South Korea embraced an export-driven development strategy. The government directed massive investment into manufacturing, particularly textiles, electronics, and eventually automobiles. South Korean companies competed fiercely in international markets. American consumers who had fought to defend South Korea now bought South Korean goods. The growth was explosive. In 1960, South Korea's total merchandise exports were worth just $32 million. By 1970, they exceeded $1 billion. By 1977, they surpassed $10 billion. Companies like Hyundai and Samsung, which barely existed in the 1950s, became global giants. Modern industries were built where there had been rice paddies. By the 1980s and 1990s, South Korea had transformed into a wealthy, technologically advanced nation. Seoul became one of the world's great cities, a metropolis of soaring skyscrapers, subways, and modern infrastructure. South Koreans who had lived in poverty just decades earlier became consumers of cutting-edge technology and global fashion. This miraculous transformation, often called the miracle on the Han River, had its roots in the war itself. American military commitment to South Korea's defense had made possible the country's development. American aid had provided crucial capital. Access to American markets had given South Korean manufacturers an outlet for their goods. The American security umbrella allowed South Korea to invest in development rather than arms. But this miracle came at enormous human cost. South Korean workers toiled in factories for long hours and low wages. Political freedom was suppressed under military rule. Environmental damage was significant. Yet the result was undeniable. A nation that had been among the world's poorest in 1950 had become a prosperous, developed country by 2000. The ongoing relevance of the Korean War. As we look back at the Korean War nearly 70 years later, it remains a complex and often misunderstood conflict. It was not the clear-cut struggle between good and evil that Americans sometimes portrayed. War crimes were committed by all sides. Millions of innocent civilians died. Families were torn apart. Yet the war also demonstrated American commitment to defending freedom beyond its borders. Truman's decision to intervene, despite the costs and risks, set the template for American Cold War strategy. It established the principle that the United States would use its military power to contain communism anywhere in the world. Some historians credit this commitment with ultimately winning the Cold War. Others argue it led the United States into quagmires like Vietnam. The division of Korea, created at the 38th parallel in 1945 as a temporary military expedient, became permanent. Today, North and South Korea remain divided, the last major division from the Cold War. North Korea has become a totalitarian state with nuclear weapons. South Korea has become a democracy and a prosperous nation. The different outcomes of the two Koreas suggest that American intervention may have made a difference, though at tremendous cost. In the United States, Korean War veterans have long complained that their war was forgotten. Hollywood made few films about it. Schools taught it as a minor episode between World War II and Vietnam. Veterans complained that America had moved on, that their sacrifice had been ignored. Recently, there has been renewed interest in remembering the Korean War. Documentaries have been made. Memorials have been built. Americans are beginning to recognize that this forgotten war was actually one of the most significant and costly conflicts in American history. Nearly 55,000 American lives were lost. Millions of Koreans died. The war shaped the global Cold War confrontation for decades. For Korean families divided for 70 years, the Korean War remains a present reality. Families separated by the border in 1950 have never been reunited. Elderly Koreans sometimes stand at the border, hoping for just a glimpse of relatives they have not seen in decades. The war, though it ended in 1953, continues to shape the lives of Koreans today. The Korean War also demonstrated the terrible human cost of Cold War confrontation. Modern warfare, with its aerial bombardment, its capacity for mass destruction, killed civilians on an appalling scale. The division of a nation created decades of suffering. Millions were separated from their families. Entire communities were destroyed. Yet it also showed that limited wars were possible. Unlike World War II, the Korean War ended in a stalemate rather than the unconditional surrender of one side. The United States chose not to escalate to nuclear war, not to attack China directly, but to limit the war geographically and politically. This decision, Truman's insistence on a limited war, may have saved the world from an even larger catastrophe. As we reflect on America's involvement in Korea, we might ask ourselves, what did we learn? How did this war shape America's future conflicts and commitments? And what do we owe to the millions Korean and American whose lives were forever changed by this forgotten war? The answers to these questions continue to matter today. More than 70 years after the guns fell silent on the Korean peninsula, the Korean War remains one of the most significant yet overlooked conflicts in American history. It cost tens of thousands of American lives, millions of Korean lives, and left a peninsula divided that remains divided to this day. It established American Cold War commitments that would shape global politics for the next 50 years. It produced both tragedy, the death and suffering of millions, and triumph, the emergence of a prosperous, democratic South Korea from the ruins of war. For those who lived through it, the Korean War was deeply consequential. For Americans today, it offers crucial lessons about the costs of military intervention, the dangers of overconfidence in military power, the importance of strategic clarity, and the terrible human cost of warfare.